As we saw last time, people imitate what they've seen modelled. Discipleship isn't just about providing information to someone, it's about being an example in the way we live that people can mimic. This session, we're going to look at the clear, simple way the Apostle Paul described his disciple-making strategy, which reflects Jesus' strategy. The simple, repeatable, transferable process he used to make disciples who make disciples. Paul writes about this in the letter he sent to the believers in Philippi. In Acts 16, we read how Paul led Lydia and her household to faith, and then the Roman jailer and his household. Out of these two homes comes what we know as the Philippian church. Sometime later, when Paul is in Rome under house arrest, he writes to the believers in Philippi about what it means to make disciples who make disciples. Paul wanted to ensure that the good news didn't stop with the believers, but got passed on to others who would pass it on to others. Paul understood that it did not all rest on him. He had a discipleship mindset and he developed a discipleship culture. In the final part of his letter to the Philippian church, Paul says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Why do we pause there? Can you see the priority of prayer? Prayer is not part of the work, prayer is the work. In fact, there's never been a disciple-making movement that hasn't been preceded by a prayer movement. One of the greatest transformations I experienced through my discipling journey is what God did in my heart as I started praying daily for my person of peace. So on in verse 9, Paul simply states what it means to make disciples. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Simple, memorable, repeatable, transferable. The Greek word Paul used for learned here is the word from which we get disciple, which is one who learns from. Even though Paul never used the word disciple, this is clearly what he had in mind. A disciple is one who learns by listening to the words, observing the works, and living out the ways of Jesus, which is why Paul can say, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." Paul says, "Whatever you've learned from me," and then he uses 4 words to describe what it means to be discipled by him. Whatever you've heard or seen or received from me, put it into practice. Just like Jesus, Paul doesn't start with "go and make disciples." He starts at the beginning and he goes through the middle to get to the end. And this flowed from relationship, from proximity. These people had spent time with Paul. They were close enough to him to have been able to listen to him and observe him putting his faith into practice, so that now he can challenge them to live out the words, the works, and the ways of Jesus. So what does this mean for us to be discipled? What does it mean for us to make disciples? Paul says it starts with this: what you have heard from me. It starts with information, an insight or a revelation of truth. Information helps build awareness and it opens our eyes to something so that we can make it intentional in our lives. For example, hearing about the concept of finding a person of peace was so helpful for me. It removed the apprehension around sharing my faith and the guilt about not leading every person I met to Jesus. I can be conspicuously spiritual. I can be authentically curious and ask good questions. I can have meaningful conversations. I can do this. What information have you heard which has brought revelation? So while information is important as a starting point, it's not the full picture. More information does not automatically mean more growth or maturity. It can be so easy in church life to reduce disciple making or leadership or even sharing our faith to simply information transaction. That if someone just has enough information, that alone will transform their lives. Jesus didn't operate like that. He calls us to both be and bring good news, to be a living, breathing example for others to see and imitate. Not a perfect example, just a personal and accessible example. That's key if we're going to make disciples who make disciples. Imitation is core to Jesus and therefore Paul's disciple-making strategy. So Paul refers not just to what you have heard me say, but what you have seen in me. He invites them to recall how they've seen him living this out, how they've seen the good news influence all areas of his life. This is life-on-life discipleship. My former neighbour is a person of peace for me. To be honest, I used to avoid contact with her until I started praying for her. She's deeply spiritual, but thinks of Jesus as a Reiki healing master. Over the years and the hours we've spent sharing together, she's seen how I live and respond to challenges. I would often let her know I was praying for her, and at first she would just say, "Thanks." Then she started asking me to pray for specific things. Recently, when I shared with her about some challenges I was facing, she told me she was praying for me. I don't know that she's following Jesus yet, but she's definitely closer than she was. So who are the people in your life that you are either following their example or you are an example to them? Paul said, "Whatever you've heard from me and seen in me," and then goes on to say, "what you have received from me." The way Paul uses this word has two parts. Receiving something in a way that I can make it part of my life. Not only that, but I've integrated it into my life in a way that I can pass it on to someone else. That I've received the baton and passed it on. It's simple, repeatable, transferable. A bit like we pass on traditions in our family. The question I need to ask myself is this real in my life? Because I can't pass on anything meaningful if I'm not living it. It's not just gaining information from what we have heard and imitation from what we have seen. It's also integration into our lives from what we have received. It's the spontaneous stuff, not just the structured stuff. It's the organic stuff we do with people, not just the organised stuff. It's the overflow of who we are. So finally, Paul says, what you've heard from me, what you've seen in me, what you've received from me, put it into practice. Paul says, listen to what I've said and let it stir something in your heart. Observe how I live this out, giving you an example to follow. Take this into your life in a way that is authentic to who God has made you to be. And then you'll be able to put it into practice. Live it out in such a way that you're able to pass it on. Hear, see, receive, and then do. As we close, there are 3 actions we can take away. First, there's the personal level. Develop a personal story, not a perfect story, around disciple making. People don't need experts who have all the answers. They need non-judgmental practitioners who can introduce them to Jesus. You are mission critical to another person's journey. Second, there's the cultural level. How do you build, strengthen, and sharpen your discipleship culture so that what you do comes out of who you are, rather than who you are coming out of what you do? It's easy to get swept up in activity. So what would it mean for every ministry to become a disciple-making activity? And third, there's reproduction. How do you train others to do this? How can you pass this on? How can you develop shared language and share the stories? Because this is not just about our own spiritual growth, but our investment in others in such a way that they can train another generation and another generation beyond them.